Hi everyone, Irina Lewis here with AtScale. Thanks for everyone for joining. So I'm joined today by three very experienced individuals. So Mark Stange-Tregear is the Director of Analytics at EBates, and he's going to really be our primary person speaking today, sharing with you his insights and thought leadership on his experience of truly going in, all in, with BI on Hadoop. Now, something interesting about Mark is that he actually started out his foray with a degree in philosophy, did a slight segue into marketing, and then ultimately ended up as a director of analytics and BI. So he might give us a little insight more on that when he introduces himself. We're also joined by Dan Kogan, who is the director of product marketing at Tableau. And then we're also joined by Dan Wilson with Cloudera, who manages the alliances across BI and analytics. My name's Irina Lewis, and I'm going to be moderating today. For our topics today, really, it's about helping you understand a little bit about why Hadoop for BI? Why go all in with all of the options that are out there? And then if you do decide to do that, where do you get started? How do you know where to go next? And then what are some lessons learned? Let's go ahead and jump into our thought leader today and have him walk us through sort of his journey. So Mark, I know EBates is obviously a well-known brand, but some individuals, it would really be helpful for you if you could set a stage with just a brief overview of sort of who EBates is, and then share maybe a bit about your role and the importance of BI there at EBates.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Irina. So EBates, for those of you that aren't familiar, EBates is a cashback, an online cashback site. So you can join as a member, and then you click through the EBates site, go shopping at so around 2,000 merchants we do business with in the US and around the world, and you get money back, effectively like an instantaneous kind of rebate system without having to write in or send in a postcard or whatever. EBates has been around for a long time. We actually, depending on exactly how you count it, something like about 5% of US e-commerce will go through EBates on a pretty regular basis. And we were actually acquired last year by Rakuten, who described themselves as the Japanese Amazon, for $1 billion. We've got tens of millions of members around the world. We have subsidiaries in Canada, China, Korea, Singapore. We also do a lot of business in Russia. So that's a little bit about EBates. With respect to myself, I joined EBates a couple of years ago, having worked with several members of the team in previous roles. And I was asked to take hold of the BI solutions, kind of top to bottom at EBates. So we do have a centralized data warehouse. We have a data engineering team that I work with very closely there. So I'm the product manager for the data warehouse, which puts me in a great position to kind of have the discussions with the business leaders around the company and the needs. I also oversee all BI software and BI and deployment of that software and usage and training on that software. And I also have a team of analysts and data scientists who are, I guess you could think of as kind of the power users of the data warehouse and the BI solutions, who help me supply data to the relevant teams around the company. Just one note on EBates, the company itself is data-driven. I mean, effectively our business is dependent on us being in control of our data. We take it very, very seriously. We are an extremely data-focused company in a way that I'd worked for other companies that said they were data focused. I'd been around conferences where companies said they were data focused. I think EBates certainly is the most data focused company I've worked for, and it really is bottom to top. I mean, I will not infrequently receive emails from the CEO 1 minute after a report is distributed, or 2 minutes later asking me about a specific line, and that kind of focus on the detail, focus on the reporting, really hammered home to me. This is a company where BI plays a serious role, and where the nature of BI and the role that BI plays will be taken very seriously, and therefore had a lot of opportunity for me in the role.
Thanks, Mark. That really kind of sets the stage. And something that I heard as you were describing both EBates and your role, one, as you were describing the company, really, you really established sort of that sense of scale. And obviously, this is not just a small operation, and therefore, that really made it clear there's a lot of data going on. And then your last description there of being a data-driven company and having a response very quickly from the executives as soon as the report goes out really kind of brings the two of those together. But how was it that what prompted you to actually make a change at EBates and look at new technologies around this?
Yeah, certainly. And we had a data warehouse. It was a SQL Server environment. We actually had a couple of different SQL Server machines working away on different parts of the company. And what we were finding was just due to the growth and the expectations around and what our end users expected us to be able to do with the data, we weren't able to either overhaul the technology or buy big enough machines to crunch the data in the way that we needed to. I think a lot of the sort of business users' expectations were set when 5, 6, 7 years ago, when the company was much, much smaller and you could stitch data together on one machine and that would just work. Today, several orders of magnitude bigger, have much, much more data. But the user expectation is the same. My internal user group expects me to effectively be able to stitch any data point together with any other data point and answer questions in a very timely fashion, effectively incorporating any components around the business or any teams around the business. And what we were finding was that we just couldn't deliver on that anymore. Our ETL processes were taking longer and longer. Queries were, either crashing the technology or that we were trying to use, or were taking, implausibly long times, 2-hour run times for a report or something. And, it became very clear that we had to do something, that the old approach wasn't going to work. The other thing that we looked at, our growth rate, the expansion of the different product lines, the expansion of the data sets that we wanted to look at. We looked at what people were talking about, what the plan, what the kind of the couple of year plan was, and realized that if this technology can't handle it today, there's no possibility it's going to be able to handle it in the future. So, we looked at it and we just realized that there was no way that this technology was going to be able to keep pace with where the company wanted to go. And I think the final thing that really made us stop and think is we were starting to get a proliferation of systems. Now, to some extent, the BI team was in control of those systems, but we were finding that data was getting siloed. We were spending more and more of our time just retrieving data, moving it between systems, and stitching it back together again. And that, of course, reduces your efficiency and significantly increases the time it takes you to answer any question. And again, the expectation that we had set in previous years is that is not how things work. Everything should be able to be attached to anything else, and questions should be answered in pretty timely and efficient manner, even at a very, very fine level of granularity. We saw that as a real risk to the way that we wanted to work and the way that our users expected us to be able to work as the systems got more and more siloed. So by the time you got the accumulation of these three things, honestly, it wasn't a hard decision. It was kind of forced on us. It was really more a matter of how do we solve this problem, rather than deciding that we had a problem in the first place.
That makes perfect sense. What's interesting is we've heard this from several organizations and large corporations and enterprises out there, and what we've sometimes found, and I'd be interested in your thoughts there, is when you were starting out and thinking about this BI on Hadoop journey, what we've seen in the past is oftentimes people think of it sort of in stages, right? That they first start thinking about Hadoop as inexpensive storage, right? It's going to be a way for me to save money and get a place where I can just store all of my data even as I grow. And then as they progress through their experience, then they say, oh, maybe I can take advantage of a little bit more. Maybe I can expose some of this to my data scientists. And then ultimately, they get to the kind of the epiphany, the aha moment where, wow, I can share this with my end users. Maybe I can make this more self-service and put BI on that. And what I find interesting is, while I've seen this with other enterprises, that this is kind of the, quote, typical BI on Hadoop journey, what I hear you saying and what in your description is that EBates really took sort of an atypical approach, how you went all in, going the full Hadoop. Can you describe that a little bit on the difference between kind of the typical journey that I described and yours?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this may just be we were a little bit late to the party. I think we did jump to the information advantage point that you have there. We really didn't go through a process where we were just using a Hadoop environment for storage or just for data science. We really did envisage this as moving from our traditional SQL server-based environment into and replicating all of that functionality directly onto a Hadoop platform. And I think partially this came about that we were, we fought long and hard to make the traditional system work. I think a lot of people go through that. The amount of intellectual property and work that has gone into these kind of legacy platforms is substantial, and the amount of work required to move them is often even more substantial. And we had plenty of other things that we could also have been working on, or could have been working on it instead. And we just never, so we had a SQL Server environment, it was working, and then it really wasn't. And we just never had the staff or the time or the focus to kind of build this side solution where it was incremental for us. We really just had to say, okay, the traditional platform isn't working. We need something that will work and that will deliver what our users have come to expect. Meet the SLAs, deal with the problems we were just talking about. And when we analyze the options that were available to us, a combination of kind of cost and functionality and honestly just kind of pure control over the data really pushed us towards standing up a solution on Hadoop directly to control not just ETL or data storage, which are nice benefits, but also for BI, for reporting, and for a variety of other things, which I think we're going to come back to later in the conversation.
Absolutely. Dan, I'd be interested in having you share a little bit from your Tableau side here.
Yeah, I mean, Mark is definitely, and the EBates team, I would say, is on the bleeding edge here of, as you said, moving to the full Hadoop. What we traditionally see is Hadoop being an augmentation to some sort of existing analytics platform. And again, in the EBates case, they were using SQL Server. And we see it rolling in more some of those areas of the data lake and just being a place to put new types of data that's not coming into your data warehouse in a bit more of an experimental ground, or a lot of clickstream data or web data, or those types of things. So it's augmentation to existing data sources, and then people trying to combine that with some of their existing relational sources that have been around for a while. But the key really is getting insights at the speed of thought and being able with Tableau to allow people to explore and answer any question that comes to their minds. And so it's great that we've seen with EBates here the ability to use Hadoop to do that across a multitude of data sources and not have to kind of maintain two separate environments.
Exactly. Thank you for that. Dan Wilson, be interested in Cloudera's perspective and what you've seen in this space as well.
Yeah, thanks, Irina. And again, as you mentioned, this progression over various use cases is something we do tend to see in the market. However, it's definitely a shift we're starting to see as the platform matures, and it's obviously not just the analytical components of the platform, but all of the manageability, governance, and security around the Hadoop platform that's really matured incredibly quickly over the past couple of years, and that's driving cases like EBates and a few other customers to be able to go straight to this BI and Hadoop. So again, it is still the exception, but we are seeing more and more customers who are going straight to replacing their traditional relational or MPP systems with Hadoop and the associated analytical technologies as well.
It's interesting because no matter what perspective, it seems that all of you are seeing very much a convergence in that direction. And so what I'd like to do now is, Mark, have us take you down sort of the steps that you went through, because for many out there, BI on Hadoop is still uncharted territory. So as someone who has done this, dove in, and actually come out successfully on the other end. Can you share some of your thoughts with our audience about how or where you chose to get started, and then how you defined and walked through some of the subsequent steps?
Yeah, absolutely. So to go back to what I was saying just a minute ago, I mean, it became pretty obvious to us at a certain point that we weren't going to be able to scale in the way that we wanted to on the traditional platform. So for us, standing up BI on Hadoop wasn't exactly like a standalone project. I mean, really, it just shifted from our development path being on SQL Server to our ongoing development path being on Hadoop, with some kind of crossover period. It's not like it has a project with a start, middle, and end. We're still actively working on it, expanding it, optimizing it, and finding some interesting bumps along the way that we're working to overcome. One of the first things that we did that we were very careful to look at before we started doing anything, including buying technology, making technology decisions, was to kind of set out the principles that we wanted to look at. So it became very important to us that we didn't want large periods of time when no one would see any results, where it's just however many data engineers sitting in a room kind of typing away. I've been in situations where that's happened. I think that can be very difficult to manage, and I think you can end up with some very negative outcomes where you have these what I think of as kind of going dark periods where people can't kind of get their hands on some kind of tangible product. So it was definitely a key part to our thought. The other thing that we made, we spent a lot of time doing up front was analyzing what are users doing with the systems today. How much are they using canned reports? Who's using those reports? Which are the ones that are getting used the most? How, what else is the system doing? How many people are actually truly sort of doing ad hoc querying rather than using pre-canned reports? And we actually got to the level where we went in user by user, identified kind of, our core executive or the real leaders around the business and looked at what they were using. And we put a timeline in place where we said, okay, these are kind of our key deliverables. These are the things that are used by the most people or the exec team members where we are struggling to deliver on the existing platform, or particularly struggling to deliver on the existing platform. So I would say our first steps were really outlining what do we want to do, what are our very first proximate goals, and how can we hit those. And from there, we started looking at, okay, so what technology we're going to use? How do we think we can, what would we need to achieve to make this a better experience for the end users? And ultimately, what's our shortest path to get some of these kind of critical reports or critical functionalities off the old system to the new system? The not particularly subtle thinking behind that was, if we can develop or deliver a report significantly more efficiently for the entire exec team, then that is going to be a very nice deliverable, kind of a good way to set this project off on the right foot. So I think that's really where we started. In terms of the actual timeline, this doesn't get done overnight. We did do this. We did the problem diagnosis. We looked at what the solutions were going to be, and then we did go into a proof of concept stage. And I mean, that actually included, we went out and bought what we would consider today kind of a small, pretty cheap commodity hardware cluster, so that we could kind of play with the technology. And this is probably going to disappoint the big data purists out there. The first thing we did was actually just replicate our traditional relational ETL process, because we had no experience with the technology, and we wanted to see if we could make this work. It turns out that it took a while to learn the technology to get everything working, but we're kind of within a year, we got to the point where we were able to deliver these kind of core kind of what I would think of as kind of some, at least, of the core reporting, the core functionality of our proof of concept cluster much more efficiently than we could do off our legacy hardware. And by Q4 in 2014, and for those of you who work in e-commerce, you'll understand this, Q4 is kind of the the litmus test. If you can survive Q4, you're probably going to be okay. We found that our proof of concept cluster was delivering reports, delivering functionality, meeting the SLAs, where our traditional environment trying to do the same thing was literally failing to deliver, not just missing SLAs, but literally not able to process the data. So that was, I think, 2014 was really the year where we set out to prove that this could be done. We then, at the start of 2015, said, okay, now that we've proved that we can do this, we're going to scrap everything that we've done, and we're going to redesign it. We're going to redesign it in a way that actually makes sense for a big data environment, not replicating what we would do on for a relational system. It took some guts to do that because we just provided these things that were working nicely and efficiently, and then we went in and told the exec team, and we're going to scrap that work and do something different. Fortunately, we got the buy-in, went out, bought some much more solid and powerful hardware, and really went into a process of defining how we want the data structures to look on the big data platform, rather than a traditional star or snowflake schema that you would use on a relational platform. And it is very different. I can go to that in more detail if anyone's interested, but we designed the endpoint very, very differently. By the end of 2015, we had re-implemented that different way of envisioning the data warehouse on the big data platform, had the core reporting, and I would say kind of, something around 60 to 70% of core functionality was running on the Hadoop cluster by the end of 2015. 2016 has been a lot about really pushing on deploying ad hoc reporting, adding functionality, and taking, and shifting the remaining, whatever it was, 30% of usage that was on the older kind of traditional platforms. And as of today, I would estimate we're running about 95 to 97% of all reporting and functionality on the big data environment. We're in the process of gradually decommissioning the old hardware, just making sure nothing breaks. At this point, there's very few users using it, so it's one of those blissful situations where you turn something off and no one even notices.
Excellent. That was a really helpful descriptive along the timeline and really brought to life. It's not something overnight, but it was really a logical thought progression that allowed you to take the next step throughout the process. And Dan Wilson, based on the conversations that some of us that we had as we were all preparing for today's presentation, the process that Mark went through seemed to align very well with the strategy and what Cloudera has been seeing with an agile approach. Can you kind of share a bit about that with our audience?
Yeah, absolutely. And this obviously comes from a lot of our work at Cloudera with many, many hundreds, thousands of companies around the world looking at, what makes our customers most successful, since we work with a huge number of organizations across different verticals and different countries. And one of the key things that Mark alluded to is, Hadoop gives you a lot of flexibility. For example, the schema being separated from the storage just in itself means that data can be acquired before it's necessarily set up to be fully analyzed, and that kind of iteration of getting data in, proving a use case, delivering it out, and then iterating and adding more sources or more types of analytics over time really is how we see our customers being most successful with Hadoop. So exactly that kind of iterative approach that Mark described of delivering value quickly and giving people access to the platforms across those different analytical interfaces is really, as I said, the best way we see for companies being successful in deploying Hadoop in the enterprise.
Thanks for that, Dan. So, Mark, whether or not you did it on purpose, I think maybe your philosophy degree and that logical approach helped you out quite a bit there, because it looks like you're aligning to what Cloudera has seen as a very successful approach. What you've walked us through thus far is you obviously had a problem and you recognized it. You put a plan in place. You walked through those steps with a specific focus, and now I think it would be helpful if you could describe what this looked like, right? what going the full Hadoop looked like at EBates, and share some of those results that you've achieved as well with our audience.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, oh yeah, thank you. So here's a visual of our technology stack. I think there's some interesting little points in here. One thing to note, so we have, we did go out, we own our own hardware. That was something that EBates takes fairly seriously. But I think you can follow this model as well on not your own machines. We started work trying to just kind of pool the data. And then effectively instead of doing what would be thought of as a traditional ETL process where we were doing a lot of business logic, doing a lot of data transform, we were trying to do that at a kind of at a semantic layer, either using tools like AtScale, or we were doing it directly in the reporting. What we found relatively quickly was that whilst you could get to the results in that way, we actually preferred a slightly different solution. So the way that our system works today is we have connections where we pull data from what we would think of as production data sources. So obviously that will be a number of different databases and types of database. We've got clickstream data of various types coming in. We hook up to external APIs. We've got even sort of miscellaneous file drops or file retrievals of one sort or another. And we pool those in a data lake where, this is unprocessed, effectively just pretty much a raw copy of the incoming data stream. What we then did, though, is we decided to stand up a series of Spark jobs that take that kind of raw data and transform it into a new set of tables. The core focus for us here was to denormalize all the data so that when you try and use the data, you're doing as fewer joins as possible. That was really the absolute guiding principle here. Like I alluded to when we were talking through the timeline, our first proof of concept, we basically just redesigned our traditional ETL onto the big data environment, and we had effectively a snowflake schema for our data warehouse, which we also replicated. When we tried to use that for reporting, it worked. Without question, it worked. But when we went in and we used Impala's analytical tools to look at how the queries were progressing and where we were getting performance issues or where things were taking time, we found that it was all on the joins. It's joining your tables. It was really taking the time. And we looked at the joins that we were typically doing, and we found that a lot of the joins were to very static lookup tables. At that point, we actually, through a number of conversations, decided that what we were going to do was flatten out. So instead of having fat tables with a star or a snowflake of dimension tables around them, we just effectively flattened as much of the data as we could into pretty wide tables. So you can think of these as traditional fact tables, but with all of the dimensional values in the table. So we would have the ID. We would also have the string value that would normally be looked up. By doing that, we were able to really minimize the amount of fact tables we were using. And today, the majority of our reporting and the other functionality, which I'll come back to in a minute, probably doesn't do a join, or if it does a join, if it's got one, maybe two joins, I would say is, even for the most complicated reporting, we're not doing much more than that. And what we found by doing that is we could really leverage the benefits of the kind of the horizontal scaling. By doing that, we could really speed the reporting, the processing up just by adding more bandwidth, adding more power to the machines. And honestly, the data volume still got crunched through in a very pleasing time frames, should we say? Massively faster than anything we could have done on the traditional platforms. So I don't know how common this is, but we effectively ended up with this sort of two two sets of tables, two stacks of data on the Hadoop cluster, and within there, a process that takes the data lake into this data warehouse. One of the reasons that we really wanted to focus on that is that, as much as we wanted reporting out of Hadoop, we actually use our data warehouse for almost as a central control mechanism for a lot of the rest of the business as well. So, I think a lot of people will have a data science kind of algorithms running on the data warehouse, and then they'll pipe that data back for other usage. We sort of take that to extremes. We pipe data back to our production servers on a regular basis. We are responsible for piping a lot of data out to our third-party vendors for calibration or conversion metrics, things like that. And one of the biggest things that we do, we actually control a lot of the emails. So rather than having and push notifications, so rather than having an ESP or a third-party provider doing the targeting and doing email or push notification send, we actually do that from within the data warehouse itself, just by calling an API endpoint that actually sends the email. What that means is that we don't have to worry about kind of syncing data between say, a third-party ESP and our own data warehouse. All of the logic is built directly on top of the data warehouse, and we make the calls as appropriate to send the emails out. Gives us full visibility, effectively gives us full visibility, almost like a CRM tool, but already triggered within our data warehouse, so we don't have to worry about latency times or updating the data or anything like that. So I think the combination of these things, really moved us forward and allowed us to do things that we'd never even contemplated trying to do with a SQL Server environment. And just a note for those of you that are planning on moving in this direction, we do use a combination of technologies. So we are using Scoop and Flume. We use a lot of Spark. We're just starting to use more Spark SQL, and we use a lot of Impala. And of course, this is where at-scale plugs in as well. So we do have at-scale cubes out there, and we connect those both to the data warehouse and directly back to the data lake, depending on what exactly we're trying to do with the cube that at-scale is presenting. We actually have multiple cubes in production. They're out there. Our end users are using them. And in a lot of situations, we're getting much better performance than we got off the traditional OLAP cubes that we had deployed on the SQL Server environment. And the data is certainly much more timely because we haven't got the ETL delays that we used to have.
That was a great in-depth explanation, Mark. And just to confirm, so that Hadoop section in the middle with the data lake and the data warehouse, I think you had mentioned that's sort of a conceptual. That is still all Hadoop. What you were describing, most of your content was all within that greater Hadoop square. Is that correct?
Correct. It's all within the Cloudera Hadoop, all on the same cluster. It'd be more, you can almost, in a traditional sense, you could just think of this as different databases, running on the same server. Obviously the analogy doesn't quite work, but they're on the same hardware, on the same machines, sharing the same data. It's just a different, an important conceptual distinction. We really did find that this is where I think we went from sort of proof of concept and into this, this really can be used as a true kind of BI plus all the other functionality that we look at kind of system, is when we realized that, hey, we actually don't need to be doing a lot of these joins or heavy processing. We can sort of subsume that in a relatively simple ETL and really reap the benefits of the power of these machines.
Great, that was a helpful explanation. And then, Mark, if we could just summarize the view that we've got here. I know you had alluded to some of this or mentioned some of this as far as like the gains that you've gotten from doing this full BI on Hadoop.
Yeah, absolutely. So to the point that the slide is making, I think we really did manage to achieve a lot of what we set out to do. From a transitional point of view, like I already mentioned, we're mostly on Hadoop. We've got one or two tiny little things that are still on the legacy systems that we're actively shutting off. The most recent kind of timelines is I expect by the end of Q3 to not be using any traditional systems at all. We're hitting the SLAs, or we're close to hitting the SLAs. There are one or two situations where, priorities have changed, and the initial SLAs that were set out, and we decided that it was okay to miss them, so we could do other things that were at a higher priority. We really got what we wanted in terms of de-siloing. I mean, and more than that, we were not only able to bring all the data that we were concerned about ending up in silos, we were able to bring all that together and make all that work together, but we're actually able to very quickly and easily, and this is to Dan's point, we're now storing multiple of the data sets that we couldn't even possibly have tried to do on the traditional environment, and are starting to really integrate that in a way that we had traditionally. And with the help of AdScale, we've now got that ad hoc real-time querying back for our end user base.
Great. Some of the pieces that you've been describing here, Mark, we had the conversation with Dan Kogan earlier, and he was saying how this really lines up with strategies that he's seen with regard to the approach to data. And so, Dan, we'd like to bring you in here and describe your cold, hot, warm strategy, and share this slide with our users.
Yeah, this is something, we typically talk to customers about Hadoop and Tableau and sort of getting down to the right level of use case again. So when people are exploring data with Tableau, they're seeing very real-time, that experience to be very real-time and very fast, and queries kind of coming back within some couple second range. And the first time they'll use our live connection to something like Hadoop through Hive, they're not very happy with that, and they see queries running a very long time. And so we sort of talking about Hadoop of this cold, warm, hot strategy. That think of Hadoop as the HDFS, as the data lake in an area to store data in its rawest form. There's been no ETL work, there's been no transformation done on it. It's the true data lake, if you will, and everything kind of lands there. Then you can start to prepare and aggregate the data a little bit more, and you can leverage faster query engines as something like a Hive, Impala, and Spark SQL being the two that we think work the best, and Impala is really the one we see the most in our customer base, and providing pretty good experience. And then finally, if for that data where you need the fastest results, the really instantaneous level of exploration, you can do that off of a more curated data set or an aggregated data set. In many cases, that's moving data from Hadoop into a faster analytic MVP data warehouse, something like an SAP HANA or an HP Vertica or Greenplum or things like that, extracting into Tableau's in-memory engine, or the way that Mark and the team did it here was using AdScale to create a cube, right, an OLAP cube or virtual cube on top of Hadoop without actually moving the data, but still seeing a very, very fast result. That's another great way to do it. But so it follows that journey very well, that you're not querying through the largest, widest set of your data with also an engine like a Hive that's not designed for fast interactive querying. You're using the right tool for the job, but also being strategic about the data as it moves and who's using what set of the data.
That's a good summarization. Thanks for that, Dan. So Mark, now we've kind of walked everyone through your entire journey. We had talked about wrapping things up as we come to the end of our session today with some of the lessons learned. You had mentioned that some were expected, and then some were a surprise.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely was a learning experience. I mean, one of the key things, I mean, I was very, very lucky to work with a very talented data engineering team, because this technology is very new to people, and I would say one of the biggest challenges we faced is actually listed number 3 here, that trying to find people who can do the coding work, who understand how these systems work and how to make them work, and are able to innovate the solutions. That is, we're constantly actively hiring to try and find these positions, and finding the staff is tough. The other thing, we knew that this was going to be important. I think the process just really cemented it for us, though, that getting executive or whoever, whatever group within the company would really have oversight to buy into the project is very important. And I do think one of the things that we made the right choice about was getting executive deliverables out as one of the first things. So from then on, I could say, hey, you remember that report that you used to get 3 days later? You now get, in your mailbox before you walk in the morning. We're working on doing that for everyone else, but they got the benefits. They saw the benefits. They could see why this was worth it. The other thing that you really do have to keep in mind is that, we tried extremely hard not to change the end user experience as much as humanly possible. That was kind of a guiding principle, but of course it did happen in some situations. And there are, there's always going to be people who don't love what you're doing. People really like the way that they used to do things and don't want it to change, and that can be a challenge. I mean, even if you can turn around and say, well, look, the data's better, the system's faster, you've got more control, we'll say, yeah, but I like the way I could, whatever it was on the old system. And, there was a lot of, I spent a lot of my time kind of talking through with people, and that is a gradual process to say, well, this is why we're doing this, and having a lot of visibility about what was going on and why we were gradually taking away some of the things that they did, or ways of operating that they did like. Ultimately, I think we found workarounds, found solutions that made people happy. The sort of end user experience I took very, very seriously through this process, and would definitely maybe treat even more seriously if I had to go through this again. And a part of that is, the fourth bullet point there, which is to make sure you're delivering, even if it's small bits, deliver very regularly so you can show progress. So you have people saying, oh yeah, I'm using, apparently I'm using the big data platform now. I didn't notice any difference apart from everything seemed faster. But, that's good to have as a conversation going around. You don't, I guess the way to summarize this is to say, we absolutely did not want this to be a stealth project. The exact opposite, in fact. We wanted to make this as visible, step by step, as humanly possible, so that people, so we didn't ever get the question of, well, what are you doing and why? People saw the benefits as we went along.
Thanks for some of those key takeaways, Mark. As we kind of near the end, we have a number of questions that were actually submitted. Before we get to that, just really quick, for anybody on the line, if you're interested in learning more, we've got a couple resources for you, whether it's a cheat sheet on but we also have a getting started guide with Hadoop and Cloudera, for those of you who haven't jumped in on your Hadoop journey yet, and then best practices with Tableau and Hadoop. For those of you who are further on in your journey and might want a deeper demonstration of some of what Mark described with utilizing his Hadoop cluster with AppScale, we've got that for you there. And so with that, what I want to do is open it up to some of the questions that individuals have submitted. So the first one, this is directed to Mark. Can you talk about the change in design and thinking, and the quotes were around design and thinking, that you had to go through in moving from traditional relational system to Hadoop, specifically in terms of how you stored and designed your data layout? So this came in around the time you were talking about your architecture slide, Mark.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And yes, I can. I would say the first lesson that we learned is that just replicating a relational, and I think this is implicitly understood in the question, just replicating a relational data warehouse with the way the technology works, at least in its current state, will technically work, but will not give you optimal solutions or optimal speed or optimal flexibility when you're trying to deploy it on a big data environment. So we realized that kind of in our proof of concept stage. One thing I will say is that I found very beneficial was the Impala tools that allow you to actually see how your queries are running and analyze them really down to an extremely granular detail, so that you can figure out where you need to optimize. We took that very, very seriously and factored that into the redesign. When we did redesign our data structures and looked at how we were going to put things together for the data warehouse that, on the big data, that was truly for the big data platform, the thing that became very, very clear was to minimize joins. We wanted as much data in single tables as we possibly could. We also spent a lot of time on our partitioning process, which this is maybe getting a little bit technical for those of you who haven't already deployed, but partitioning is a way of kind of segmenting the data on on your big data platform, so that processes like Impala can go in and only read from certain files. It can, when done correctly, it can massively speed things up. The difficulty when you're trying to replicate, depending on exactly what you're trying to replicate, is trying to figure out exactly what your partition strategy should be. You don't want too many small files. Ideally, you want a lot of big files, as long as you're not having to write to them or rewrite them on a regular basis. And I say fought with for a while that kind of balance on the partition size and how to remove as many joins as possible. I feel like we're at a stage that I'm okay with, but that is definitely still something we are working on, trying to innovate around how to make that work better on an ongoing basis.
Okay. Thank you for that, Mark. And I think that gets to it, the whole thing that you've been saying the whole time, right? That this is a journey, but obviously you're approaching it with a logical thought process and you're making headway. And I think that additional detail will definitely help our audience. So thank you for that. We have another question here, and we've got quite a few questions just to set the stage with the audience. If we're unable to get to all of the questions today, we will get an answer and get that back to you after the fact. So if we don't read it out loud, we will get that answer back. But here's another question that's been submitted, and it comes from a gentleman by the name of, oddly enough, Mark. So Mark's asking, Mark, I've heard companies move data from Hadoop to a fast database for analytics. Why didn't EBates take this approach?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I wouldn't necessarily say that that is a bad idea. That may work for some companies. What we found was that a lot of our core reporting and other core functionality required us to be doing, and this is maybe specific to us, but I'm sure other people can relate, we were doing a lot of distinct counts. We were doing a lot of aggregation that involved distinct counts. And we also had a user base that was very used to being able to cut the data in a variety of different ways and, as I mentioned right at the top, live by the data. So they really wanted this, they wanted to be able to do these kind of aggregations at multiple levels and, on the drill down on the fly. What we found is that the power that we could get from this distributed cluster in terms of actually doing these distinct aggregations was going to be faster than, for our reporting, was going to be faster than putting it on a single machine, because we would effectively have had to replicate, all of these huge wide fact tables onto the relational machine anyway, at which point we would have had to go to a much, much more expensive solution than we already had, or we would have actually got slower performance because it couldn't handle the aggregated counts as fast. Now, if you're primarily looking at situations where, say, you're just counting the number of events, or you're doing simple kind of sums over additive measures or something like that, you may find that it actually makes more sense to sort of have pre-aggregated data at various levels and treat it more like a traditional kind of cube, and then copy the data off to a relational type system. For us, because of this drill down, because of the amount of distinct counts that are kind of core to our business, it really didn't hold the benefits for us. And also, by the time we'd gone through this process of kind of redesigning the data structure for the big data environment and deployed the reporting, the reports were coming back much faster than our end users were used to, which kind of bought us some breathing room. I mean, we were delivering better than they were hoping for anyway in a lot of cases, if not most cases. So to some extent, with the pressure came off us to have to speed it up even more. Now, we are continuing to look at that. We are continuing to think about that. We're looking at new technologies, say like Hadoop, that may potentially be even faster for this kind of, where it could still be distributed, but maybe faster access. We did start writing files in Parquet rather than raw text format to speed the data recovery off disk. So again, and this goes to what Irina was just saying, it's an ongoing process of optimization, but we found that we could basically meet our user expectations without adding that whole nother technology stack that we would then have to manage and feed data to and manage that process. And just the lack of adding that complexity was very appealing to us. It allowed us to work on other things.
Thank you so much for that, Mark. I think that was helpful across the board. I want to thank my speakers today. Mark, thank you so much for sharing the level of detail. You obviously put a lot of thought into this, and I think all of the attendees will have found this very helpful, especially those who have yet to start their journey, so thank you. I'd also like to thank Dan Kogan and Dan Wilson from Tableau and Cloudera respectfully. Thank you to everyone, and have a super day.